There we go. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Regina Lewis. I'm a member of the Committee of Informing Assessment Policy of NCME, and I think we have a great conversation today. We're going to have a panel of experts from around the world, literally, and who are going to talk about accountability in the different forms it takes throughout the areas that they have expertise in, but it's going to give us a little light of what happens out there outside of the United States. And just a little, I chose the title because I don't know, it's a play on the book Around the World in 80 Days. And so I hope that we can talk about this around the world in accountability in 80 minutes. And I'll start first by introducing our discussant, David Rutkowski. And David, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how things are going to go today?
Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is David Rutkowski. I'm a professor at Research Methods at Indiana University. I thank you all for being here too. I wanted to thank Regina Lewis for putting this all together along with the committee. We have a great panel today. I'm going to introduce them in just a little bit. And I'm really excited to kind of be with you all and learn from this really distinguished panel. Regina, do you just want me to go into it?
Yeah, I think we need to be, because people are still pouring in, but yeah, go ahead and get
Okay.
started.
I just want to set the context really quick, and I'll just take 2 minutes. One of the things that I often remember, at least when I talk to people, is that education is a really big idea, right? According to the World Bank, government expenditures on education are about 4.2%. And when we look at military expenditures at 2.3%, this means a lot of money is being poured into education. And something I often challenge my students when I teach educational policy is we look at governments around the world of where their largest spending is. And even in states like Indiana, education becomes one of the largest pie of spending, second to health. But in other countries, health might be number one, but education is often the biggest thing. And why does that matter? It's because accountability. When there's that much money in a system, you're obviously going to have issues around accountability, right? But who's going to be accountable, right? Is it the governments that are accountable, the parents are accountable, school accountability, teacher accountability, and student accountability? And one thing that I found interesting with my work and my international work is every culture and every country takes a little bit different task on who's actually responsible. And that's what's kind of cool about their panel today, is that we're going to talk about there is all of this money in education, and a lot of people have decided that it's really important, but who's actually accountable? We take different forms of accountability. I'm in the US right now, and we often try to be leaders of everything and leaders of accountability as such too, where we had started a long time ago, especially not preceding that also, but with No Child Left Behind. We have issues around Norway, Afghanistan, places that I've worked a lot. In Norway's an interesting case because they had an accountability system, and then the OECD came in, an international organization, and told them kind of how to develop a different type of an accountability system. And we have global governance through accountability. If we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, and they could be seen as accountability systems for countries. So my point here is just that we have different accountability systems around the world, but they all kind of fall into this framework of holding educational systems accountable. Difference in opinion exists of whether and which accountability practices affect equity or performance and achievement. Are differences related to differences in policy and practice? Are they related to context and culture? Or is the interpretation of data where these differences lie? And that's one of the things that when we talk to the panel today, we're going to try to unpack this a little bit. And what I imagine we're going to see is that there's different perspectives of what accountability means, and there's different perspectives on how countries go about holding different aspects of their educational system accountable. And to me, that's really exciting, because that means that we can learn about how different systems do it, and hopefully improve how our own practice of accountability systems can work. So I'd really like to just briefly introduce our distinguished panel. And the reason I'm only briefly doing this is because part of what the panel is going to talk about is their own experiences and what they do. So I'm not going to go too much deeper into telling us who the panel is. Norman Emerson, we're really pleased to have him. He's an international consultant in assessment. He's really worked around the world in many different countries, so he's going to bring a really nice perspective. William Smith is our next, and he's a professor at Edinburgh University, University of Edinburgh. I've seen his work. He does work in international assessment and also accountability systems. And Marie Teresa Flores Petor, who's an assistant professor at the University of Chile. And if anyone knows anything about accountability, Chile is a really very interesting case study. So Regina was very nice to provide us with a set of questions. And so what I'm going to do is just really, there's two main questions. And as you see, there's some sub questions. I'll say what the question are, and then I'm just going to ask the panel to address the question. They were given these questions in advance. So the first question is, briefly describe the accountability system for which you have experience or expertise. What are the cultural contexts? Who was involved in the design process? How long did it take? How is equity integrated in the system? Does the system evaluate or promote autonomy? Is this a system designed for purpose of continuous improvement? Of course, I know these are a lot of questions, and we don't have time for an hour response. And I'm sure all of you could give an hour response on all of these. So you don't have to pick all aspects of this question, but hopefully you could provide us just with a little bit of an overview of the system and address some of these questions. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it to the panel. Does someone want to volunteer to go first, or also I can pick someone? No volunteers so much. Norman, you were first on the list. How about you?
Thanks for that, David, and thanks for the colleagues in the States for the invite. And I'm hoping that I can offer some of my experience, but also discussion learned from others. I think the conversation is going to be about. As you hear from the accent, from Scotland, worked most of my career in Scotland, and Williams and University of Edinburgh. Just now, I'm in Slovenia, where I'm based. I'm currently working in the Republic of Georgia, not the state of Georgia in America, ex-Soviet republic that's recently gained the first step towards membership of the European Union. And the political dynamics that are ongoing in around Russia just now, that's fairly important. It's fairly close to Ukraine. It's got a history of Soviet invasion recently over the last 10, 15 years. So cultural context in the Republic of Georgia and the move away from the Soviet domain and legacies in education that and accountability that went with that is quite a significant context. And similarly, so their priority is try to bring their education system more in line with Europe. That'll be one of the tests, a number of tests that they will be in line with European 21st century competences, for example. Those. So the cultural context is quite significant there. This move away from the Soviet legacy, aspiring to membership of the European Union. I'm working in there for a World Bank funded project, working with the Georgian government in that context, taking forward a national review and implementation of assessment and evaluation, which involves school improvement, which involves diagnostic assessment, and formative assessment, a whole countrywide improvement initiative funded by the World Bank on a loan basis to the Georgian government. There are other agencies, including USAID, are heavily involved. So accountability comes into that picture in terms of the donors coming from various backgrounds. The EU is involved, obviously, USAID, World Bank, a variety of partners working to support in this development. Similarly, I've recently worked in Tajikistan, which for colleagues who don't know is out in Asia, former Soviet state, again, after a civil war in the 1990s, they had independence. They, again, moving slowly, much more slowly than I would say Georgia, towards removing that legacy of Soviet education policy, where everything was centralized and local autonomy was something that wasn't part of the picture. So these are two countries where cultural identity is quite important. Georgian people are very proud of their identity as Georgians. Tajik people are very proud of their history from the Persian culture and so on, and the language, and where in a place Russian language dominated, moving away from that, and the legacy and education is quite a big shift. Again, USAID, EU, World Bank, all involved as donor organizations in making that shift. They are focusing again on a shift towards what was previously accountability about how well students were equipped to learn, memorize, rote learning, towards the development of competences. 21st century competences are very much, I was involved in the first national survey of student performance across the country, a sample survey which looked at every region in the country, and the report published highlighted the regional differences which existed, which probably the government were aware of before, but it was the first time that it had come because this survey hadn't been carried out before on that scale. And it's the first step towards involvement, the aspiration of Tajikistan to be involved in PISA, and this was seen to be a dry run for that. So involved, I'm aware of time, David, so I won't go into too much detail in Georgia and Tajikistan, but it just gives you a flavour of the culture there, and this move away from Soviet centralised control towards breaking away from that, looking to Europe, looking towards America, funded by American agencies, and trying to grasp the agenda for education for the 21st century, which is this focusing on well-being, critical thinking, competences. Who was involved in the design process? In both these countries, I worked for the EU in Tajikistan, and the design process was in partnership with the governments both in Georgia and Tajikistan. But the idea was in both countries that a holistic view should be taken of the process of accountability and assessment, that all layers of the system, and I know this will be of particular interest in the States, that there should be coherence and consistency at all levels of the message. So the planning for Tajikistan 2020 to 2030 is focusing on trying to get those layers in line in terms of the accountability agenda. And that's a big task. That's a big task in a country which is making baby steps in terms of the education agenda. Georgia is much more further advanced in terms of that, looking for that coherence and consistency. And I give the analogy of, in terms of the approach to accountability, I've got an old-fashioned watch with lots of pieces inside it. If one of these pieces doesn't work properly, in partnership with the others, then the watch doesn't work. So the big message in Georgia is that we need to get coherence and consistency, that teachers and school leaders and regional managers and people at the centre are all on the same page when it comes to assessment and accountability. And there's no mixed messages given at any level. A lot of the design processes, in my thinking, in my work in these two countries, and in my work in Scotland and in Ireland, has been on based on the work developed by OECD, and a kind of significant piece of work on this, I'm sure many of you are aware of, is the 2013 document Synergies for Better Learning, which looked at the assessment and evaluation practice in 29 countries, and they looked at the best practice or the emerging practice from these countries, and one of these messages was about synergy, about bringing together the various levels. Another message was about giving ownership and ensuring that everybody felt part of it. The top-down approach, which was previously part certainly of the regime in Tajikistan and Georgia from Soviet times, to build bottom up, to build greater ownership from school level and at regional level, and to try and give greater control and move that away from the centre without losing focus on the central ambition of improving the system, the education system as a whole. How long does it take? Well, in Scotland, for example, we'll move on to that. Curriculum for Excellence, which is the kind of main curriculum driver, has been ongoing for 20 years, and assessment was a significant part of that. I played a role as Director of Curriculum, Director of Assessment in Scotland, and then laterally in Ireland. So 20 years, and a sort of test was taken. The Scottish Government, you know, all government responsibility is with Edinburgh, with Scottish Government Edinburgh Education, and they asked the OECD to come in, how are we doing, and write a report. So the messages and the advice in that report, published about a year or 2 years ago, gives a sort of indication about the progress that's been made and the progress that's still to be made for Scotland. A similar step was taken forward in Ireland, where OECD were again brought in there was big issues in relation to senior cycle in Ireland, where there was a sense that the focus was on a point system and the accountability was on how well schools did on gaining the entrance for university. And the rest of the students who perhaps wouldn't take that route, perhaps the inclusion aspect was being lost. And certainly the well-being, I visited many schools and captured student voice, and coming from students, they were saying that the pressure on them, the significant pressure impacting on them because of the high stakes associated with these exams when they were 16, 17 and 18 was significant and was significantly affecting the well-being. That came through to politicians, and the review was carried out of the senior cycle system to look and broaden it, to be more inclusive, and to move away from something that puts so much pressure on students. And a big driver was this focus on well-being, which has become part of the system, not only in Ireland, in Scotland and other European countries, and I'm sure in America as well. And does the system evaluate or promote local autonomy? Yeah, at the basis of, if we talk about Ireland, Scotland has 32 local authorities. If we equate that with the system, the federal and the state system, in America, you have that similar tension between local authorities, the basic responsibility for education overseen by Scottish Government, and the improvement plans, and in terms of assessment, building the Curriculum 5 was a key core document, evaluation document, that over document had to be implemented at a local level, given local autonomy to small authorities in the islands, but also the large urban authorities, for example, in Glasgow and Edinburgh. I think there's some, in terms of scale, it's not the same, but in terms of the idea of 30 local, relatively autonomous local authorities under an umbrella of a Scottish Government education policy, and into this mix, and I don't know the extent to which the States has this, comes an inspection system. Both Scotland and Ireland have inspectors, long-standing inspection system, who bridge that gap between the central and the local. And the inspection policy is looking at schools, but how local authorities are carrying out their role in relation to education. Is the system designed for the purpose of continuous improvement? In Scotland, that was a key aspect of the OECD report published last year, that Scotland and there's a significant buy-in to this focus on a broader aspect to what should be assessed and evaluated, that we should be beyond what students are successful at learning. We should be looking to how effective they are at teaching. As citizens, the whole aspect of putting the focus on not just the learning, but the OECD report said that this needed to be planned long term. It just shouldn't be for 5-6 years. It should be a longer and should be a continuous process of improvement. Otherwise, they argue that when the cold winds blow from a PISA report that doesn't quite fit with the agenda, then it tends to be knocked off and there's a knee-jerk reaction. In terms of PISA, Scotland has flatlined and then dipped over recent years. Ireland, on the other hand, has gone up. And, you know, people from Singapore are facing similar problems in terms of addressing the attainment agenda and doing well in that, like Ireland on PISA recently, but also ask questions about at what cost, to what extent are we putting so much pressure on young people that their well-being is being affected. So, David, that's a quick snapshot. I can go into detail of any aspect of that, but that's 4 countries that I've been working in, and totally different in many ways, but similar agendas in terms of moving towards competences, moving to a folk well-being, and striving to ride this horse of PISA in terms of making sure that the public profile in terms of PISA attainment is moving up, but addressing other issues of well-being.
Norman, thank you so much. There's so much to unpack there, and I'm sure the group's going to have a ton of questions. I've also worked in the region in Armenia and Kazakhstan, and one of the things that you mentioned that I think is super interesting is how accountability is seen as a Western or Eastern concept, or especially for the former Soviet Union countries or Soviet bloc countries, that this idea of looking towards the West and their assessment systems kind of is copied in one sense, but also is seen as a way of getting closer to the West. It's a very, very interesting realm of ideas. Yeah. Thank you very much. Maybe if we go to Maria Teresa, and if she can just speak briefly, or not briefly, I normally took about 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll give you the same. If you wanted to speak about this question here, and then we'll go to William, if that's okay.
Yes, I was wondering if I can share a few slides,
Sure.
but just not to be super long in the presentation.
Yeah.
There are different cases I'm addressing, but I'll go quickly through points that are similar to those that Norman was highlighting. And then if there is interest in a particular case, we can then go in more depth with that.
Sure.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So just briefly, the sources of my knowledge around different systems come from the work of the study group, the assessment study group that we have in the Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities in the University of Chile, that is reconnecting broader concepts of social justice with education and assessment. And one strand of that research is also exploring and researching and systematizing alternative approaches to assessment policy and practice to see what the emerging horizons of social justice are in those cases. And in that context, we have collaborated with colleagues from South Africa, Norway, Mexico, United Kingdom, Argentina, among others. So that's how we know about that. And we have some publications in connection to that. And I also participate in the Latin American Network of Research on Assessment, with a group of Latin American colleagues. We share two areas of interest. One is a shared recognition around the tensions of current assessment policies and practices, and again, exploration of alternative approaches to assessment policy and practice, but with an emphasis in Latin American countries. So we have seen the cases of Uruguay, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Peru, among others. So along with other research projects in which I have been involved with international colleagues. One thing that maybe hasn't emerged in the conversation yet is that I think it's risky to talk accountability as a single term without a surname, because it seems like it could naturalize a specific understanding of accountability. And I think we need to recognize that different models or approaches to accountability are embedded in different ideas of education and society and assessment. Otherwise, these systems wouldn't be contested in different countries, as we can see in some of these pictures that are from contexts like South Africa, Seattle, Chicago, Chile, Australia, Spain, Argentina. And that doesn't mean that actors from school communities don't want accountability. They probably think it's an important thing, but they differ in their view of accountability. So I think that's an important point. And that's why I want to add the surname to this. Probably we'll see that with William as well, because he in the report where he participated, there are more categories of accountability. I'm using the one by Falabella and De La Vega. So they at least mention three approaches to accountability. Bureaucratic accountability that has a focus on generating indicators, reporting, and it's more frequent in more centralized state-oriented models. Professional accountability, which is more related to some of the things that Norman was mentioning, that has a focus on internal and local assessment systems, community involvement. And when there is external assessment, it's low stakes. And it's more commonly seen in societies with a more egalitarian vocation, with a strong emphasis on public education, and also that promotes school autonomy. And we have this other concept, which is, I think, the one that people mean when they talk about accountability without a surname, which is performative accountability or high stakes accountability, that is usually focused on census-based standardized high stakes assessment with result-based incentives and sanctions and publication of results. And this is specific from market-oriented models of education. So I think it's very important that we think that it's not just a matter of describing different ways of understanding accountability, but to think about education, society, and a system that is consistent with what we want to promote in a system. Otherwise, the risk is to naturalize a particular view of accountability. I know this because with colleagues from the Latin American network I was talking about, we have studied, we have made a critical analysis of the policy trajectories between international organizations and Latin American countries in connection to accountability, quality assessment, assurance systems and assessment. And for example, the documents of the World Bank that I had to analyze for the Chilean case, well, they put Chile as an example of a lot of things, as a positive example of innovations, without mentioning that those innovations are connected to the imposition in a dictatorship of a market-oriented model of education in Chile. But also they promote a specific idea of accountability without the surname, like it's a single way of understanding accountability. So I think the risk is to naturalize a specific approach to accountability. Just to provide some examples, if one would like to think about a bureaucratic model of accountability and assessment, a case that I'm familiar with is South Africa, specifically the National Protocol for Assessment Grades. It has an initial intention of continuous assessment and school-based assessment with a goal of improvement of learning. But according to Kanji and Sayed, the problem is that government guidelines finally emphasized more formal assessment and reporting rather than the use of information and informal assessment in classrooms to generate the improvement. So that would be a case where there is an emphasis on recording, reporting, and that involves a lot of teacher overload as well. A case of professional accountability could be Norway. They have a test, national test, that are census-based, but are low stakes and are thought for internal use and local use. And part of what they understand as results meetings, these are meetings between different actors of different levels, like Norma was saying, to discuss results, and they discuss results among many other things that they need to improve in schools, to make shared decisions with an idea of shared responsibility. To highlight the political nature of this, both the introduction of this test was controversial in Norway, along with the publication of results, that's still controversial, because it's not consistent with the historical assessment culture of Scandinavia, what is known as the Scandinavian model. So they introduced them and it was controversial. And today, depending, according to Sketsmo and his colleague and her colleagues, it depends on the government that is in office if a publication of results is emphasized or the formative components is emphasized. And also in connection to what Norman was saying, there are different, the local level is very important, but it depends on if the municipality has a more horizontal leadership, where discussions are better received by school communities, or if there are more top-down approaches where things turn more towards a high-stakes approach to accountability. And as a very extreme case of performative and high-stakes accountability is where I come from, Chile, with the National Quality Assurance System and the CIMSE tests as part of that system currently. Is a census-based battery of tests. It's very high stakes. It has increased its frequency throughout the development of this policy, and consequences attached to its results have increased. It's related to teacher salaries, funding for schools, the potential closing of schools with repeated low results, and widespread publication of results with rankings in media and things that you probably know about. However, there is no conclusive evidence about its benefits, and there is increasing and consistent evidence in the last decade about its negative effects, which is consistent also with international evidence in connection to performative or high stakes accountability. So maybe I will close this first intervention with this, just to open discussion. When you add the surname to accountability, you can question the assumptions of the specific approach to accountability that is predominant in Chile and in other countries, for example, in England, in Australia, where the assumption is that regular standardized assessment, along with the with sanctions and incentives and public exposure, in a market-oriented model where competition and parental choice are fundamental, school improvement will happen. But in my own research about the construction of assessment policy in Chile, and also this research I was mentioning with Latin American colleagues, this seems to be more a statement of policy documents, that's something that is supported by evidence. It's a theory of change that is not really supported by evidence. Evidence, at least for the last 30 years at an international level and 10 years in Chile, refers to effects you all you know about, and that also William mentions in the report where he participated. Teaching to the test, narrowing the curriculum, frustration, demotivation, lack of pedagogical innovation, discrimination, segregation, impoverished teaching and learning, teacher burnout, stress, gaming the systems, among others. So the question here first is, and that's the point of inflection that we are experiencing now in Chile, because during the pandemic, CIMSE was suspended. And now we are in the point that if changes are not made, we are going back to an increased frequency of tests because of the plan that was designed before the pandemic. But the question is, why? Why do we insist in this approach to accountability if we don't have enough evidence about its benefits? And if the evidence that we have is that it's not generating improvement, but rather an impoverishment of schools? So the next part, but I don't know, David, if I should stop there and maybe then go to this part, because it's how to overcome the shortcomings of market-oriented accountability. And I have some ideas and examples from an international perspective, but that mirror a lot of what Norman was mentioning in terms of a holistic concept, articulation between levels and actors, participation and not top-down approaches, and synergy and consistency of messages, consistency between levels. So if it's relevant, I can then continue with that.
Yeah, maybe if you stop there, and we'll give William a chance to address the questions, and then I'd like to then open it up to see if the group has some questions. So if that's okay, thank you very much. It's very interesting. William?
Yeah, thanks, David. So thanks so much, Norman and Maria, for getting things started. So my name's Will Smith. I've been in education for about 20 years and been focusing my research on accountability for at least the last decade. So I started my career as a teacher during No Child Left Behind in the States. And I think that basically started my interest in accountability, because I was wondering why we had a policy that we really were encouraging people to forget about the poor performing students and teach what is known as teaching to the bubble or teaching at the margins. So those right around a pass rate. And I was interested to see how what I've talked about as a punitive approach to accountability in education, whether that is just a US model, whether that's something that is replicated elsewhere. And so from that experience, I've been looking at cross-national trends in accountability. And that led me to UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, where I led the 2017-18 report on accountability in education. So most of what I'll be talking about today are looking at global trends, and I'll just talk descriptively about what I see and kind of save the what I think we can improve on and what might be the consequences of what's happening for hopefully the next round. But I think it's quite important. So David mentioned that different perspectives on what accountability means. And one of the first things we realized when we were trying to get the accountability report going at UNESCO was that accountability isn't even a word in all languages. Like we were trying to figure out the translation of accountability, and there was accountability and there was responsibility, and sometimes those meant the same thing in different languages. There was sometimes they were basically the same word, and sometimes accountability didn't exist at all. So it seemed, for the most part, to be a fairly Western intervention, almost invention at the time. There was a concept that was there in most cultures even if the word wasn't there, about this type of relational, I need to give an account of my progress towards somebody. So we looked at the translation pieces, and then we looked at definitions for accountability. And I'll get to Maria's point because I think it's very well taken on you need a surname for this. But we try to give the most general idea of what accountability is. And we looked across a ton of different definitions, and we came up with 3 core pieces there, which is that accountability is relational first. Like you can't actually be accountable to yourself. That accountability is based on the giving an account to another actor, and that account needs to be based on some moral or legal foundation, basically. What is not in UNESCO's definition, because it wasn't consistently found across the literature, and this might surprise people, is that accountability doesn't have to have a sanction and reward to it. That is something that is commonly seen in what Maria rightly talks about as kind of this default model of accountability, where we have sanctions and rewards often to schools, but that's not required in accountability. And so more recently, this coming year, I'll be publishing a chapter that looks across the different, what I talk about as typologies of accountability in education. And this gets to the heart of what Maria's talking about, because the default model is this kind of very neoliberal focused model that looks at markets and focuses on teachers and schools, uses test scores to hold them accountable through kind of a market or punitive intervention. But what's important to recognize is that there's actually a huge variety of potential accountability approaches out there. So when you think about all the different questions you need to answer in building an accountability policy, which some of them were laid out to our questions earlier, but like who is accountable, for what, for whom, how do they render an account, what is the result of giving an account, and what is the relationship between who gives the account and who receives the account. All of those point to different surnames, whether they're high stakes accountability or teacher accountability or performance-based accountability. And together, they should inform an accountability approach or policy. The challenge is that the assumed policy that's out there when we look at generics is this kind of neoliberal policy, which has this underlying ideology that answers all those questions, right? Which really push it to a market perspective. So the other thing to think about is who, and I know we're talking about schools here, but one thing that's important, and we tried to distinguish here, is the difference between responsibility and accountability. Okay, so you can have individual responsibilities and you can have shared responsibilities. Okay? So I would argue that helping children learn, or children's learning, is a shared responsibility, just like education, building, good citizens is a shared responsibility. And shared responsibilities is not something I can be accountable for individually. So we need to distinguish between individual responsibilities, where somebody can be accountable, and shared responsibilities, where multiple people are required to act in a collective effort. So with that being said, despite everything we do in schools, it's unlikely that schools are going to be able to, push children to greater learning without understanding the full context of education and society and who else is accountable. So very, very briefly, a couple other actors that are accountable here, and some general ways that they're held accountable with some kind of broad numbers around that. So one, the primary actor accountable for education are governments. Governments are the duty bearers for the right to education. They are the primary actors responsible and should be held accountable for education. So, and all countries across the world have ratified at least one international convention that specifies the right to education. So that's a right to free universal primary and progressively free universal secondary. And there are descriptions and holistic, beautiful descriptions of what the right to education means for quality. And most of those are captured in Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 on caring for other cultures, caring for the environment, education for things like peace, and so forth. So all countries have signed on to an international law that specifies that. But when we look at countries' constitutions, only 82% of countries have the right to education in their constitutions. And furthermore, and this is analysis from the Right to Education Initiative, barely over 50% of countries have the right to education in a constitution and justiciable, okay, which is quite important, because that means that there are countries out there that have the right to education and believe they have the right to education. Examples of this would be Bangladesh and Tanzania. But if they tried to take the government to court saying that their rights have been violated, they don't have that right? So there's no real recourse at this point. So it's nice window dressing. When we think about the right to education, the US doesn't have the right to education. The right to education is not included in the federal constitution. That was supported by a 1973 Supreme Court decision that there is no national right to education in the US. So therefore we've got individual states, and individual states have different levels of rights. Some don't have the right to education in the constitution, some do. One notable court case is from Kansas, which quite a while ago now, this Kansas Supreme Court said that they need to provide $38 million more to public education because they were not funding the school equity. All right, so that's government. The second group that we forget about sometimes are parents. Now, there's different ways to hold parents accountable. The most common way actually isn't useful at all, but it's the most common, which are truancy laws. So trying to make sure parents are getting their students to school. So we looked at truancy laws in 34 countries. We found that most common way parents are held accountable is if their children don't attend school and aren't truant consistently, they're fined. That was a third, well, 35% of the 34 countries. The second most common was fined and jail time. And then 3% were using jail time. The jail time could be substantial. So in France, parents can receive up to 2 years in jail for truancy laws. In Singapore, it's 1 year. Maximum fines can be up to about $1,000, depending on the country. And there's no evidence that any of this is useful for reducing chronic absenteeism. What it really does is just kind of create a cycle of poverty where you have poor families then having to pay fines, and therefore individuals missing more school, and just continuing this crazy cycle of poverty. When we look at students, there's, again, different types of accountability for students, but high stakes exams is one of them. So this suggests that individuals are individually responsible for their learning. Again, this is a problem. But high stakes exams are when students can proceed to the next level, or they decide what type of education is available. And usually these high stakes exams are at the end of primary or lower secondary. The Center for Global Development recently, in 2022, just mapped out the state of high stakes exams in primary, and they haven't gone in many countries. So 80% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa have a primary leaving exam. And this is important because in some countries, pass rates have severe consequences for children. So some research I did looking at Uganda, their primary school leaving exam basically prevents 50% of students from continuing into public secondary schools. If you don't continue into public secondary schools, you can't sit for the secondary leaving exam. You're not going to qualify for anything else. And it means you're also paying for it, where the public secondary schools are free. And that individuals that were failing and unable to proceed were more likely to be girls, and that was true in Uganda, Malawi, and Kenya. All right, and final bit for me is looking at educator, so schools and teachers, and this is where most of the attention, as Maria rightly put out, is on this test-based accountability, or what I've called testing for accountability. So we looked at national testing policies, and we were focusing on schools and how schools are held accountable for student test scores. Looking at over 100 countries, we found that about 33% included a market-based approach, which is essentially what Maria talked about. But we also distinguish between a market-based, or what we've talked about as evaluative approach, and a punitive approach, which is also something that Chile has, where we've got publicly aggregated school level test scores, and then we have fines, sanctions or rewards added to those. And that was found in about 16% of countries. Interestingly, those type of testing for accountability or test-based accountability approaches are more common in high-income countries. And on the other side, there were 4 countries that didn't have any national testing policy category, and that was the Czech Republic, Greece, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. Final, yeah, I think a couple of final things. The No Child Left Behind policy, which is obviously a punitive policy that sanctioned low-performing schools during that time in the US, and there's changes with every Student Succeeds Act, but not maybe real substantial, was also influential. So in South Korea in 2008, it moved to what some people have talked about as a No Child Left Behind model, where they moved from a sample-based assessment to a census-based assessment. They adopted many of the similar components where tests were aggregated at the school level. There were public report cards that were tied to school evaluations. And over a 6-year period, there was substantial backlash for that. There's massive pushback from teachers and parents. So the next presidential cycle, there's a substantial reduction in test. So the number of tests went down and testing for accountability was eliminated at the elementary level. The accountability piece, oftentimes school accountability and this kind of test-based accountability has been associated with autonomy. So you'll see that from the OECD quite a bit, where you have a school accountability with autonomy model. Tony Verger and others have been talking about this as well and doing a lot of research on it. The idea is that, you know, schools need to have the autonomy to be able to adjust their pedagogy for to improve achievement scores. However, interestingly, if we look at just the effect of accountability on its own and just the effect of autonomy on its own, oftentimes it's the autonomy that actually is the beneficial piece there. Yes, there is a multiplier, but autonomy by itself can be good. Accountability by itself is not. And yeah, all right, I think I'm gonna go, well, actually, do I have 2 minutes, David, or?
Go ahead, and then we'll open it up for some.
Okay, finally, just talking about teachers real briefly. I want to talk a little bit about teacher appraisals. So I've done a good amount of work on teacher appraisals. Now some people say, well, why are we talking about teacher appraisals? Should we talk about teacher evaluations? Really, they're the same thing now. There's the formative part of teacher appraisals is gone. So looking at TALIS data, which is 33 primarily OECD countries, Kaska Kubaka, myself, found that like 79% of teachers have high stakes included in what is considered their teacher appraisals. Right? And that out of the 33 countries that were included in TALIS, only Spain and Japan had less than 40% of teachers in these high stakes appraisal systems. Now, appraisals are based off a lot of different things. So student test scores, observations, student surveys, self-assessments, and parent feedback. And the most common pattern across these 33 countries are all of those in teacher appraisals, with very few countries having any teachers that are only based on test. But when we think about how appraisals are used, tests are a humongous part. Tests are still the most common bit. 97% of appraisals include student test scores more than teacher observations, which is kind of weird. And when they are included, the feedback is prioritizing student test over everything else. So things like teacher collaboration or teachers working with special needs. That includes in England, 98.5% in England are working in high stakes test-based system. In England and the US definitely come out as the most test obsessed here. That differs from Finland and Denmark, which place a lot more emphasis on their on peer collaboration when giving feedback on appraisals. And finally, when this emphasis on appraisals is combined with principals telling teachers that they're the ones responsible for test scores, it creates a school testing culture that also has a negative association with teacher satisfaction. All right, so I'm gonna stop there. Sorry, David.
No, thank you. Thank you, panel. I'd like to open it up for questions now. I know we had another question set aside, but we only have about a half hour, and I know there were already some questions in the chat. I guess I could start with one of the questions in the chat and then we can move from there. So if you have questions, you could put them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, I'm happy for to call on you. The first one that I see here is from Richard Phelps. He said, I hope the panelists would highlight the variety of accountability methods that can help improve student achievement. That is not only a market focused goal. Some students and families want for their own sake to learn as much as they can and optimize the potential. But this only seems possible these days in some East Asian countries. Everywhere else, it is prohibited from even being tried with full OECD support for fuzzy standards and stakes. Does somebody want to speak about that?
Just that wasn't the first question, because there was another one first.
Okay, I'll get to that one next. If you want to go with this one first, since I read it.
Well, maybe I can connect it to the previous one,
Okay.
just to address what Aliyah was saying, because she's asking if you can have the different models are related to different levels of the system, so you can have a high stakes component at some point, or at different levels. And maybe I can relate that to what Richard Phelps is saying about if high stakes are all bad. Well, according to the evidence I reviewed, at least, it's complicated when in a single, and that if I understood well what Norman was saying about synergy, you can have that, and in many systems you have a mixture of things. The problem is that when you have a mixture of things, that is also connected to political discussion and tensions, and it adds tension to the system. I will explain through some examples. In Singapore, for example, that has a very historically has a very examination-centered culture, is trying to move away from that since 2009 with a primary education report that was published at that time, because they have the tension of this very I've talked to people with experts from Singapore, and they talk about the extreme meritocratic model of Singapore, because they have this culture, but it's to the expense of the students' well-being and to the detriment also of the quality of teaching and learning. So they are trying to move away from that and prioritizing assessment for learning, holistic assessment they use as a concept. But the problem they have is parents. Parents are still very, they emphasize this examination-centered culture. So the problem is that when you try to articulate different ideas of accountability in a single model, is something you can do, but it can generate tension. Like in the case of Norway, for example, they have a publication of results, but it's controversial because, for example, there is some evidence about what happens in teachers' meetings in Norway. And what happens there is when they are in a municipality where a lot of focus is put on results, discussion between teachers moves away from pedagogical practice and in-depth discussion about that. And they try to think how to improve results, how to improve the number. So the nature of discussion changes. So I couldn't give an answer like it has to be just one or the other. But what I can say from evidence is that when you try to articulate different approaches to accountability in a single education system, you usually will see these tensions. That's why some systems like Uruguay, for example, or Wales are trying to move away from a high stakes approach, and they are trying to explicitly address an exclusively formative purpose for the whole system. And that involves things like what Norman was saying as a synergy between the different levels, All the levels are in charge of raising a specific kind of information. They have dialogue, they interact, they have constructive dialogue and feedback, so they can improve. So, for example, another tension that you can find is that it's very difficult to provide rich, timely, contextualized information if an assessment system is high stakes because it's confidential. For example, in Chile, for a long time, the only information you had was the score. They improved that, and now you receive the percentage of students that are in a specific level. But you receive that a year later, when you're not working with those students anymore. So in terms of the expectation of use for pedagogical practice, is not, I'm a teacher as well, that's my background, my initial background. So it's not much you can do with that. So it's an assumption that it's useful for pedagogical practice. And that's different from the cases of Uruguay and Wales, where you have a system that is open throughout the year and where schools can use these systems to see progression throughout the year, and they have access to detailed information and immediate access and feedback about what happened with students. So I don't know if I'm trying to answer both things, and I think it's a matter of perspective and positioning. So I would say that consistency generates a better synergy throughout the system. But in practice, you can find mixture of models in different levels. And what you're going to see, at least according to evidence, is tension between those approaches.
Thank you. Norman, there's a question for you from our colleague from Kazakhstan. And I think it's an interesting question. As someone from Kazakhstan, your explanation of assessment evolving away from the Soviet legacy deeply resonated with her. She said she's curious about the specific steps either Tajikistan or Georgia are taking to distance themselves from the Soviet legacy. Maybe could you talk about some of the specific steps, and especially within assessment and school assessment would be really interesting. I think you're muted. You're muted, Norman. No, we can't hear you still.
Yeah, and David, he doesn't appear to be.
No, he doesn't appear muted. There must be something with the microphone, Norman. Is that possible? Oh no.
He's
let's
working
see.
on it.
Okay.
Do we want to move on to
Perhaps.
Sydney's addition to what
While Norman's getting his thing together, does somebody else have a question? I know there's one more. There's another question in here. If possible, I'd like to add to Elias a question about whether the type of accountability exists within a single level. And Richard's point about whether high stakes is all bad. I think that's a really interesting question, and I know we've painted Maria and William have some nice examples. Oh, Norman's back. We can hear
so,
you. Go ahead.
Okay. So, interesting question, close to my heart because I spent four and a half years in Tajikistan. Basically, lived there during COVID times, and I got underneath the bonnet of some of the tensions that exist, particularly in terms of education, where the older generations looked formally at the regime, which provided them with what they felt was a good education. And they felt that the new moves were not serving young people as well. So that tension with an older view, old generational view about the good times of the Soviets being here, money, jobs, and then the shift to the Civil War, and then this shift towards a focus on Persian ideals going back into history. Certainly the schools that I visited, there was a lot of going back into and referencing Persian heroes in terms of writers and poets. So there was evidence certainly in the school walls and classrooms of trying to bring back into play some of the old traditional aspects of Tajik education and literature and history. It was visible in the classrooms. In terms of the language, a significant priority. I noticed the comment here in the question is about perhaps downplaying the importance of language in Kazakhstan because of the Soviet rule. I saw, instead of that in Tajikistan, an enhancement of the language in terms of everything needed to be published in Tajik. And our colleague will be well aware that there were limitations in the language in terms of the technicalities, which, say, an OECD document translated into Tajik didn't capture the full essence, whereas an education, the same document translated into Russian would be immediately understood. So issues in terms of language, but certainly the government there were holding the line that Tajik was the main language of communication and that Russia was not to be used in terms of communications, official documents that were being translated. However, I think if this is a legacy,
I think we've lost Norman. Oh, he's back.
We lost you for a second, Norman.
maybe I'm away again.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. If we're talking about moving away from a very heavily centralized system of autonomy, where there's only one word, which so the idea of collaboration and community of practice and all of that, where you could share your views and have different views, and students could have their views, voice, and that they could reflect on their learning. If you're moving from a system where autonomy and there was one word which was the right word and it came from on high, that was still there. That was the cultural shift that needed, I felt, to be changed. For example, if you asked in a school head teacher how things were going, if you asked that question in Scotland, you would get a mixed picture. We're doing well here, self-evaluation, we're doing well here, we could improve here. That conversation, by and large, wouldn't happen in Tajikistan. Everything was fine, everything was good. We're on, until you went actually in to look at the practice. So I think culturally, a lot to be done in terms of moving away from that very top down, giving greater ownership at local level, and the sense in which you can say, we're not doing everything well and we need to improve in these certain areas. Until that cultural shift from Soviet times is moved, then the ambitions and aspirations to develop students' competences like self-evaluation and self-reflection, I think will take a while to come. I hope that answered some of the question.
You did. Thank you very much. I'll go back to the other question then, and maybe William, you could take this one up. What about this idea, is high stakes assessment all bad? And I think it's a really good question, especially in the sense of accountability.
Yeah. So thanks, Richard, for your question, and kind of Sydney for the follow-up on that, which I'll try to touch on a little bit. So yeah, Richard, I'm well aware of the meta-analysis you've done, and I've cited it multiple times. I think that when we look at the relationship between test-based accountability, so there's high stakes, put on test scores, and student achievement, what we see is a mixed effect, right? And so your meta-analysis obviously shows a small positive effect. A similar meta-analysis just before yours by Lee also showed a positive effect, but also cautioned that basically the effect does not lend any strong support for claims of school accountability. So others have talked about how there's maybe an effect, but the practical significance for the gain is negligible. There has been some differences in effects between putting accountability, so the Kanishek has found effects that have demonstrated that accountability might be greater in a punitive system than in a market-based system. So when you do have those rewards or sanctions, my own work has shown that basically when you control for selective practice, looking at piece of data, that a lot of the positive gains is a selection effect. And so, I think, for instance, when I start and I control for selective admissions and selective transfer policies, so schools that are either using achievement scores to bring in or move out students, that there's no association left between market or punitive systems and student achievement. Similarly, once we start controlling for time in mathematics, that most of those effects go away. Schools in these kind of systems are just spending more time in math. So, for instance, the schools in the systems were doing more selective practices, and that was especially more prevalent in private schools. Nearly 90% of private schools in punitive systems use selective transfers and kick out low-performing schools or students. So I think that the high stakes question is interesting because there's lots of evidence that accountability has the ability to shape behavior. We're just not always sure if it's in the right way. And the idea of achievement really goes kind of down to the core of what we want in an education system. And Maria talks about some of this. What is the primary purpose of education? And it starts weighing a little bit on, is some of the mixed results or potential results for increased achievement were some of the equity concerns? Is it going to be able to provide sufficient feedback for the classroom? We can go back and forth on this, but I'm not certain that it's, that it warrants what we're seeing as far as the stress, satisfaction, potential self-harm. We saw even, suicide in England a couple of months ago. We had a school head commit suicide because of the high stakes put on school inspections. And so we've got a new round of reviewing kind of Ofsted in the inspection system here. So I think that there's a healthy debate to be had with that. I don't think it's in stone, but high stakes obviously shape behavior. It's just not necessarily the behaviors we're looking for.
William, maybe can you talk a little bit more to this point, because I think what Richard was saying too, and it's a question I bet a lot of people, and especially in this room, will have. But is there anything else in the world that we would spend so much money on and not have high stakes? Some high stakes.
Well, I think
assessment.
I think we could. Well,
in health, we would have the same, right?
Correct, but health is an easier thing to measure, though, right? Like that's part of the big difference between health and education is that education, it's the idea that, and donors are doing this, right? They're doing kind of performance-based lending here, where test scores are often used now as part of the donor system, and that's not as efficient as doing the same thing for health because, okay, did you vaccinate individuals? Did they stay away from the flu or, COVID or whatever? Yeah, you can track that versus learning, which is really a societal process. So I think high stakes may have a place if you can figure out the responsibility for it, right? Mm-hmm. I think that high stakes around, teachers should lose their job if they don't show up for work, right? We should have accountability bits. That's their responsibility. They need to show up for work. I'm also fine with teachers being held accountable for their instruction, which they have control over. Now, instruction should effectively lead to some type of achievement gains, but there's plenty of reasons why that might not. And so holding teachers solely accountable for achievement doesn't make sense. Holding them accountable for their instruction and doing class observations, sure. So I think there are potential places where high stakes might make more sense, but we have to think about, obviously, what behavior change that is going to emphasize and push. So yeah, I think, so I think it comes down to this type of clarifying roles and responsibilities as well.
Can I add to that in the sense that if the expectation is improvement, rather than high stakes, what you need to design in an accountability system and in an assessment system related to that is means of support that help people to move towards that behavior that you're expecting. Because if you don't have any feedback and the only action that the government is doing is testing you every once in a while and tell you that you're still doing badly, that changes are not going to happen. But the expectation that the right changes are going to come just because I'm going to punish you or reward you, that's going to generate a distortion of practice or gaming the system, as evidence has shown, rather than deep change. And also, again, you have this clash of purposes. I mean, in Chile, for example, the assessment of teachers involves a process of class observation, portfolio, everything. And the initial agreement with teachers was that the purpose was going to be formative and it was going to be related to feedback and support. But then they added consequences and the whole process started with distortions. And you find all types of different practices that tell you, but it's a natural thing because for a formative purpose to be possible, you need to know that you can make mistakes and that it's not a bad thing to make mistakes, that it's part of my learning and that someone is going to support me and there will be spaces for professional development where I can improve that. But if you're going to tell me that I can be fired because of that as well, I feel more inclined to try to show something that is going to please the observer or the assessor. So I think that's when the different models are clashing in their purposes and how genuine improvement is finally in terms of long-standing changes.
Thanks. Thank you both very much. I would like to open it up to someone to ask a voice question if you would like, if you want to raise your hand and unmute. I think you have the right to unmute the microphone, hopefully.
While we're waiting, David, could I just maybe add to this conflict between high stakes and
yeah, I'd love to hear your
bring
perspective.
together. Just a reflection on my experience working in Ireland, 5 years, 6 years, working for the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, where I was brought in a role to introduce classroom-based assessment and support the shifts there. In a country where the State Exam Commission, that was the gold standard. If you were going to have assessment, and assessment only meant one thing, it was sitting in an exam hall and doing a test, particularly the years 15, 16, 17, senior cycle. The most resistance to that shift towards teachers making the judgments came from teachers' unions themselves, which for me, coming from Scotland, where the opposite was the case, where teachers having the professionalism to make assessment judgments was seen to be something which was part of the teacher's craft. But the culture in Ireland, and we're only 30, 40 miles across the sea, was so different in relation to assessment and accountability that accountability was done by the State Exam Commission. Now, over the years, we resolved it, and we had a junior cycle profile of achievement, which on the right-hand side contained the results from the State Exam Commission, and on the left-hand side contained the classroom assessments by the teacher, moderated within the school by other teachers, supported by standards nationally provided of what, for example, an excellent piece or exceptional piece of work would look like in any subject, including oral communication. Ireland is a rich country for oral communication. If you've ever been to Dublin or Ireland, you'll know this. You know, people love to talk. So oral communication exhibited on national website for teachers to look into, to see what an exceptional piece of oral communication would look like, fitted really well with developing 21st century competences, that you weren't just measuring what could be done in exam hall. Now, the big shift then had to be, what would students and parents value on this profile of achievement? Would they immediately look to the right and they say that is of value, or see the achievements on the left? And culture is such that naturally people would say value on the right. But there was a small step towards trying to say there was a broader approach to assessment and accountability for students' assessment than just an exam hall assessment. And there were other things that students were doing which were of significant value, which could be assessed in different ways. So I don't know, that was an attempt in Ireland to try and bring and broaden the focus of assessment and accountability.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Norman, very much. Richard, for everyone in the group, Richard had another response to how that conversation went. Again, I'd like to open it up to see if anyone else has, we have about 8 more minutes left. All right, well, I'll ask one question then for the group. So where do we see the future of assessment going, especially school assessment and high stakes assessment? And we only have a couple minutes, so maybe everyone could take a 2 minutes. Are we in a realm of that this is going to be a big thing again, that that we're going to have a renewed focus after COVID on high stakes school assessments, or are we moving in a different direction? What, from your experience in working in other countries and your experience globally, what do you see as happening? Norman, do you want to go first?
You broke up just at the end of it. So I take it you were asking, would the assessment agenda, would it become more to the focus? Would
Yes.
it become a greater focus after COVID? I think for sure, you know, I mean, it's and perhaps COVID levered something in the system, that because you couldn't hold exams, that the accountability and you had to assess students, then the assessment system in many countries was nudged in a particular direction towards teacher assessment. And I think that changed the dynamic. Okay, lots of debate and argument about it, but somehow COVID provided an opportunity and further discussion. Do we continue with some aspects of that? Teacher responsibility for assessment judgments, or do we go back to what we had previously? Or is this an opportunity to broaden the focus?
Thank you, Norman. We'll go to William and we'll give Maria the last word.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a little bit of a snapback from the most extreme bit. I think people are recognizing that things are over tested. I mean, you know, China's trying to move away from test-based and go to quality-based education. Individuals like South Korea and the States have moved away from kind of the larger No Child Left Behind models. And so I think there is a small reduction, although the idea of it is going to be maintained. I think we missed a moment around COVID, and so Maria's talked about Chile very kind of quickly ratcheting back. We're seeing the same thing in the UK and other places where there was a pause on this and a chance to kind of rethink how we're doing some of the assessment. And instead, it was a very quick retraction to old practices. So I think, you know, we're maybe not at the far bit. We do recognize that there are some well-being issues with the amount of testing that we're doing on students and some of the stress that it's causing on teachers as we're a little bit farther. But the idea of test-based accountability is still there. And there is definitely what I'm seeing, at least in some countries, is a quick snapback to pre-COVID practices.
Thanks, Will. Maria, Teresa.
Well, I think of the pandemic as a catalyst for rethinking about assessment systems. I still hope there can be some changes after that, especially because during the pandemic, finally, these high stakes assessment systems were not very helpful. And there were alternatives that were developed that were more useful for supporting schools. What I see as an emerging paradigm from different cases I've studied and in connection to our reflections on assessment and social justice is that some assumptions of accountability need to be, we need to rethink those assumptions. The assumption of transparency, which is used as an argument in favor of accountability, because it's a positive thing, needs to be readdressed in terms of quality, consistency, and richness of the information that is generated, and that has to be directed to specific actors for whom this information is relevant, and also in a low stakes context. I think there is widespread and increasing recognition that low stakes is a precondition for a formative purpose in a large-scale system to work. In terms of responsibility as an assumption of accountability, we seem to be moving between trust and accountability as external control. And I think in terms of the dimension of social justice that need to be addressed there is participation. And some systems are moving towards a co-construction and participation of actors at different stages of the system, from diagnosis of critical aspects, proposals for change, professional development spaces also in connection to that, and also the need for articulation between levels, actors with clear chains of action. And finally, the assumption of improvement, we seem to be moving from an assumption of this default model of improvement, where it was really impoverishing education, to a model or an idea of more holistic approaches to learning and education. So not just literacy and numeracy, but also potential for including other areas and disciplines, emotional aspects, social aspects, formative purposes, providing consistent messages in terms of what pedagogy and skills and ideas you want to promote throughout the system, avoiding contradictions, and also consideration of context and diversity beyond avoiding bias. Considering diversity and context as a valuable experience and approaches to knowledge and learning. Great. So I think there is a trend in different systems towards that direction, but maybe it's less visible. And when you start studying more systematically different systems, you can see that the ones that are insisting in extreme high stakes models are not that many. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Regina, do you want to close this out?
I think I'd like to thank all of the participants, or the panelists especially, and we had a huge, very diverse and encompassing conversation, and we just addressed about half of what we had hoped to. So I think in the future we might consider a part 2 for suggestions, as I know that's some of it was embedded in what you have mentioned, but there is definitely an interest as we move forward in, even like we find the some countries looking to the US as a model, and yet the US is in flux itself, trying to figure out what's going to work best, especially coming out of the pandemic and considering more holistic perspectives that include student well-being. So I'd like to thank you all, and I'd like to thank also Donna, who just popped in, for helping recruit the panel, and remind you all that NCME is a wealth of resources, and that we need to share these resources and and promote us as an organization of expertise, but also of networking. And any final comments, David? I think
no, I just want to thank you, and I want to thank the panel. It was a great discussion, and I look forward to more of them. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you all,
Okay.
and I'm gonna close this out.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.